were everywhere. Red and white badges on every dock, every trailer, every summer memory. Engines that started after a winter under a tarp and dragged half the town's kids to their first fish. Sounds like a brand too big to disappear, right? Here's the twist. Johnson didn't die in one moment. It was unwound by tightening emissions rules, brutal competition, OMC's collapse, and a quiet corporate decision to back Evinrude, while Johnson was rebadged, downsized, and slowly faded out. By the end of this video, you'll know how a lake legend became a logo on a storage barn. The regulations, the rivals, the bankruptcy, and the deliberate choice to end a name that once ruled American water. At the end, we uncover what really happened to Johnson Outboards and why its ghost still lingers at the marina, the brand that went from everywhere to nowhere. You can feel the story and the gap between memory and what you see at the dock today. A moment ago, we were talking about how Johnson seemed to vanish without anyone calling out the time of death. To see how strange that really is, you only have to look at what replaced it. Walk through a modern marina, and the pattern is almost boring in its predictability. Yamaha cowlings line one row. Mercury logos dominate another. Suzuki badges flash here and there. Maybe you spot a Honda on a quiet little skiff, but the brand that once defined American lake boating hardly appears at all. Johnson is not a choice on the sales sheet. It is a story older boaters tell. Those older boaters do not talk about Johnson like a line item. They talk about it like family. It was the engine that dragged a tin boat through weed-choked channels to their first real fish. The motor that still lit off in spring after spending winter under a sagging tarp in a leaky shed. In some towns, you could pull into a grocery store lot on a holiday weekend and count Johnson decals on half the trailers parked in the sun. That is what makes its disappearance feel so unsettling. There was no farewell model year, no big ad campaign saying goodbye, just a slow, quiet thinning. One season, there were fewer Johnson engines on the racks. The next, a couple of dealer banners came down and were not replaced. Eventually, the only Johnson branding left in some marinas was a faded sign on the side of a storage barn, half hidden behind stacked docks and climbing vines. From a distance, on paper, it is tempting to flatten all of this into corporate shorthand. You can say that Johnson's story is about parent companies, balance sheets, emissions rules, and technology that did not keep up. That is not wrong, but at dock level, this did not feel like a tidy business case study. It felt like watching a familiar boat push into morning fog and realizing only much later that it never came back. To understand why that hurts more than a simple logo change, you have to remember what Johnson was at its peak for most of the 20th century, especially from the early 1900s through the 1970s. Johnson Outboards were one of the default answers to a simple question. What are you running on that boat? The engines were not always elegant, but they were dependable, fixable, and everywhere. If your neighbor had a Johnson, there was a good chance your uncle did too. Local mechanics knew every bolt and bushing by feel. Parts sat on shelves in small-town hardware stores next to nails and paint. Owners' manuals were soft with grease and fingerprints. You trusted a Johnson because everyone around you already had. Johnson did not build that reputation on flashy experimentation. It built it on thousands of little victories. Engines that tolerated bad gasoline and skipped tune-ups. Motors that forgave owners whose idea of maintenance was rinsing off the cowling once a year. Fishing guides ran them dawn to dark. Rental fleets abused them. Family boats overloaded with coolers, dogs, and kids leaned hard on every horsepower during long weekends. Yes, Johnson shared space with Evinrude, often under the same corporate roof, but in many towns, Johnson was the friendlier, more familiar name. Blue-collar dealers lined their docks with Johnson rigs. Summer communities painted Johnson logos on wooden signs as casually as they painted the town name. From that vantage point, the idea that the brand could simply vanish felt almost absurd. And yet, beyond those docks, forces were starting to shift. Regulations were sharpening their teeth. New competitors were arriving with quieter four-strokes. The water around Johnson was changing, even if its engines and many of its loyal owners did not see it coming. When the golden age began to crack. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the water around Johnson was changing faster than the company was. Emissions regulations tightened. The United States of America Environmental Protection Agency and other regulators began focusing more seriously on the impact of two-stroke exhaust in lakes, rivers, and coastal waters. At the same time, manufacturers from Japan and other regions were pushing hard into the outboard market with advanced four-stroke technology. Yamaha brought smooth, quiet engines that sipped fuel and met emerging standards more easily. Suzuki and Honda followed with their own efficient four-strokes. Many boaters who grew up on smoky, loud two-strokes took a ride behind a modern four-stroke, and realized that boating did not have to sound or smell the way it always had. Johnson, along with its sibling brand Evinrude, was heavily invested in traditional carbureted two-stroke designs. Those engines made great power for their weight and were simple to fix, but they were not clean. Meeting the new rules would require aggressive rethinking. That meant heavy investment at exactly the moment competition was rising and margins were tightening. Dealers began to notice a slight shift. Customers, who once walked into the showroom asking specifically for Johnson by name, started asking broader questions. Which engines are cleaner? Which ones will still be legal on my lake in 10 years? Which brand is ahead on four-strokes? Johnson still sold well, but the automatic assumption that it was the obvious choice began to soften. The cracks were not yet enough to sink the brand, but behind the scenes, the company that controlled Johnson's fate was facing a much bigger storm. If you have experience with Johnson Outboards, good memories, bad breakdowns, or hard choices you had to make, share them in the comments below. The real story of this brand lives in those thousands of individual boats and families, not just in the corporate decisions that ended production. And if hearing that side of the history helps you see the bigger picture more clearly, tap like so I know to keep making these long-form breakdowns. Make sure you subscribe as well, because the next episodes in this series dive into other outboard stories that faded for reasons the brochures never explained. The corporate storm behind the scenes. Johnson did not live alone. It existed under the umbrella of a larger parent, Outboard Marine Corporation. For years, that structure helped. The corporation spread costs across multiple brands, shared engineering, and used scale to keep prices competitive. But scale cuts both ways. As the 1990s wore on, Outboard Marine Corporation stretched itself thin. It bought companies, juggled product lines, and tried to fight on many fronts at once. To answer four-stroke competition, it rushed advanced two-stroke technologies to market, including complex fuel injection systems and direct injection designs that promised cleaner running without giving up power. On paper, these engines looked like a perfect answer. In the field, some of them turned into nightmares. Engines that should have been bulletproof showed up in shops with odd failures. Software glitches, injector issues, and calibration problems left some owners stranded and some dealers overwhelmed. Warranty budgets swelled, confidence shrank. Mechanics who had spent careers praising Johnson's toughness suddenly found themselves apologizing to angry customers. At the same time, the cost of tooling up for new technology and meeting regulatory requirements climbed. Outboard Marine Corporation was carrying debt, facing intense competition, and losing the one thing it had relied on for decades: the assumption that its engines were unquestionably trustworthy. None of this was a single fatal blow, but together they built pressure inside the company, like water arriving faster than the bilge pump could clear it. Ultimately, the numbers caught up. Bills outran revenue. Lawsuits and recalls mounted. The parent began to sink. When Outboard Marine Corporation finally collapsed, Johnson did not simply stumble. It was dragged down in the same wave, the collapse that took Johnson with it. By the late 1990s and into the turn of the century, the situation snapped. Outboard Marine Corporation could not outrun its debts, its warranty liabilities, and its technological missteps. Bankruptcy filings turned what had been a slow, worrying decline into a blunt cliff. For thousands of dealers and countless owners, the impact was immediate and confusing. One week, Johnson and Evinrude banners still hung over their doors. The next, phone calls started coming in with phrases like reorganization and asset sale. Engines in crates sat on floors with uncertain futures. Parts pipelines went from reliable to unpredictable in a matter of months. To the average boater buying a used rig at the time, it might not have been obvious. A Johnson on the back of a 15-foot runabout still looked like a Johnson. It still started when you turned the key, but behind the scenes, the company that built it no longer existed in any familiar shape. This could have been the end of Johnson entirely, a clean break, a name lost in the wreckage of a failed corporation. Instead, something more complicated happened. Another company stepped in, bought the pieces, and chose a path that would keep Johnson technically alive for a while longer, while quietly setting the stage for its disappearance. When a new owner picks a favorite, when Outboard Marine Corporation finally hit the point of no return, its collapse sent shockwaves far beyond boardrooms and court filings. For decades, the company had been part of the backbone of American boating, the caretaker of the Johnson and Evinrude names that hung off millions of transoms. When it failed, the question was not simply who would buy the leftover assets. It was whether these brands, once woven into the fabric of lake life, had any future at all. Bombardier Recreational Products stepped in with the kind of resources Outboard Marine Corporation had not seen in years. To boaters looking looking in from the outside, this felt like the rescue people had been hoping for. Here was a company known for building tough snowmobiles, powerful jet skis, and highly engineered recreational machines. If anyone could modernize Johnson and bring it back into the new century, surely it would be a group like this one with deep pockets, engineering pride, and a global reach. But inside Bombardier Recreational Products, the internal calculus was colder than the public hope. The company had acquired two historic brands, but it did not intend to rebuild both equally. Evinrude was chosen as the future, the brand that would carry Bombardier Recreational Products' advanced direct injection two-stroke technology. Evinrude became the spearhead for the company's attempt to stand toe-to-toe with Yamaha, Honda, Mercury, and Suzuki in a market that was shifting rapidly toward cleaner, more efficient engines. Every dollar invested into new tooling, new fittings, new molds, and new electronics was aimed at Evinrude. And Johnson was not positioned to rise again. Internally, Johnson became a softer, quieter category. Smaller four-stroke engines sourced from partnerships, repainted, rebadged, and marketed to boaters who still trusted the name but were not demanding cutting-edge innovation. To a dealer flipping through brochures, the change felt subtle. To the engineers inside Bombardier Recreational Products, it was deliberate. Dealers felt the tension immediately. Some were told to push Evinrude aggressively, positioning it as the modern, cleaner, more powerful option, the engine for people who wanted the newest technology. Johnson, meanwhile, was described in softer terms: dependable, familiar, uncomplicated, a safe alternative, but not the technological flagship. Other dealers described the direction differently. Two brands, overlapping sizes, competing for the same limited customer budget, supported by one set of corporate resources that was clearly tilting toward only one side. Customers began to notice strange things too. New Johnson engines seemed oddly familiar, as if they had seen the same cowl shape on a different brand last year. Parts diagrams no longer matched old Johnson layouts. And when people asked questions, does Johnson still make their own engines? Are these really new? Dealers often danced around the answers. In the moment, it did not feel like the end. It felt like a period of confusion, a strange half-transition. But the truth was simpler. Johnson was still breathing, but the oxygen had already been redirected elsewhere. Johnson was still technically alive, but it had already been moved to the edge of the stage, and everyone who looked closely could sense that something had shifted, even if they could not yet name it. A brand kept on life support. In the early 2000s, you could still walk into some dealerships and find Johnson Outboards tucked into a back corner or listed quietly in a catalog, but the lineup was shrinking fast. Fewer models, narrower horsepower ranges, and the spark that once made the brand feel alive, new designs, new engineering, new excitement, was disappearing quicker than most loyal owners wanted to admit. The engines told the truth long before anyone said it out loud. These were not classic Johnson powerheads built in familiar factories. Increasingly, they were rebadged, four-stroke motors, sourced from outside partners, dressed in white paint and a legacy logo. Older boaters didn't care. For them, the Johnson name carried decades of trust, childhood memories, summer mornings, engines that seemed to run no matter how many mistakes their owners made. But younger buyers saw something different. They compared spec sheets, emissions ratings, warranty support, noise levels, and on paper, Johnson stopped looking competitive. It wasn't leading any category. It wasn't pioneering new tech. It wasn't pushing the market forward. It had become a brand built on history, not momentum. Inside Bombardier Recreational Products, that divide became even clearer. While Johnson received rebadged models and minimal marketing, Evinrude's advanced two-stroke E-Tech program absorbed nearly every engineering dollar and every bit of corporate attention. Advertising promoted Evinrude as the future. Dealers were incentivized to stock it. Trade shows showcased it front and center. Johnson, meanwhile, was pushed to the edges, present, but no longer a priority. Dealers adjusted quickly. They ordered fewer Johnson units each season. They stopped pushing the name unless a customer specifically asked for it. Many gently nudged buyers toward brands with clearer long-term support. And slowly, Johnson engines stopped appearing on showroom floors altogether. The decline fed on itself. Less promotion meant fewer sales. Fewer sales meant no development. No development meant fewer reasons to buy. Eventually, Bombardier Recreational Products faced a simple reality. Keeping Johnson alive offered sentimental comfort, not strategic value. And within the company, the conclusion became nearly inevitable. Keeping Johnson alive was a sentimental luxury, not a strategic move. And in a tightening, competitive market, sentiment rarely survives the spreadsheet. Still, for many boaters standing on the docks, the moment when Johnson truly truly died was not corporate. It was emotional. It was the moment they looked at a new lineup and realized the name they trusted was no longer meant for the years ahead. Why Johnson was removed on purpose. Inside corporate strategy rooms, decisions like this rarely involve emotion. They involve cost columns, product overlap charts, and long-term brand positioning. Supporting two names in the same horsepower classes meant two catalogs, two marketing budgets, two dealer messages, and twice the confusion. Meanwhile, Evinrude's advanced two-stroke technology needed all the focus the company could give it. Johnson's problem was not that consumers disliked it. Johnson's problem was that it no longer served a distinct purpose inside the new lineup. It was not the innovation leader. It was not the clean-sheet four-stroke competitor. It had become a nostalgic alternative in a market increasingly shaped by emissions rules, efficiency standards, and aggressive engineering races. So a line was drawn. The Johnson brand would end production. No final push, no last hero model, no farewell announcements. Just a soft conclusion letting inventory run out, while warranty obligations were met behind the scenes. For most boaters, the news arrived casually, almost offhand. A dealer shrug, a quiet, "not anymore," when someone asked if new Johnsons were still available. On paper, the decision cleaned up the company's portfolio. On the water, it meant something else entirely. A century of boating identity was now something you could only find used on older boats or on forgotten racks behind small town shops. A name that had once ruled the lakes was no longer part of the new world being built, and that silence said more than any official announcement ever could. Aftermath that owners still feel today. When you see a Johnson on the water, it is almost never new. It is an older engine that has outlived its corporate parent, kept alive by careful owners and the dwindling number of mechanics who still know the intricacies of its carburetors and ignition systems. Parts are still out there, but they are not on every corner anymore. Some components are only available as old stock finds or salvaged pieces from donor engines. Younger technicians, trained on modern fuel systems and diagnostic laptops, sometimes look at a Johnson with curiosity rather than familiarity. For owners, this creates a difficult choice. Keep maintaining an engine tied to a vanished brand, betting on its mechanical toughness and your ability to find parts, or finally admit that the next major failure might be the last, and repower with a modern outboard from a brand that still has a clear future. On the used market, Johnson engines walk a strange line. For some buyers, they are red flags, orphaned products from a company that no longer builds them. For others, they are icons, worth preserving because they represent a way of boating that feels simpler and more direct than today's electronically managed power plants. The quiet legacy Johnson left behind. It would be easy to say that Johnson is gone and stop there, but that would miss what it still quietly leaves behind. Modern outboards, even the most advanced, still carry echoes of the era that Johnson helped define. The expectation that an engine should start after a winter in the shed. The assumption that you can get parts without needing a corporate translator. The belief that a family can build traditions around a simple, reliable motor and a small boat. Johnson did not invent those ideas, but it imprinted them on generations of boaters in a way that few brands ever have. You can still see Johnson's shadow in small lake towns where old signage clings to buildings, and in stories passed around campfires. In those stories, the brand is less a casualty of corporate collapse and more a symbol of a period when boating felt less complicated. Right or wrong, that feeling matters. There are also harder lessons in Johnson's disappearance. Lessons about what happens when a company falls behind on technology, when it overextends financially, when it underestimates how quickly regulations and competitors can shift the ground under its feet. A familiar name and a loyal customer base can carry you a long way. They cannot carry you forever. In the end, Johnson's disappearance was not a single villain's fault. It was the sum of changing laws, aggressive competitors, risky engineering bets, and deliberate strategic choices by new owners who decided the brand no longer fit the future they were building. Walk a dock today, and you might go an entire afternoon without seeing the Johnson name. But if you listen to the stories older boaters tell, it is still there, idling quietly in the background of their memories. 100 years from now, someone will probably find a Johnson outboard in the back of a barn, wipe the dust off the cowl, and wonder what happened to the company that built it. The short answer will be that the market moved on and the brand did not. The long answer is everything you have just heard: the regulations, the rivals, the bankruptcies, and the deliberate decision to retire a name that once ruled the water. If you lived through any part of that story, if you owned a Johnson, worked on them, or watched them disappear from your local marina, tell your piece of it in the comments. If this deep dive helped make sense of where that brand went, tap like so I know to keep uncovering the stories. The brochures lead leave out. And subscribe, because the next chapters in this series are already taking shape, and you will not want to miss which familiar names might quietly be heading down the same path.